So we left with David making this incredible proclamation, exactly prophesying right to his enemy. He's not doing this secretly and saying, yeah, that's what I said, put it in a sealed envelope. He's just speaking it publicly, even to the people that he's addressing, of what's going to happen in this battle. And of course, it's not looking like a fair fight. David's been offered Saul's armor. It doesn't fit. He feels clumsy with it, so he just goes out, takes his slingshot. It says he has 5 stones. Takes those out with him, and he goes to confront Goliath with a slingshot. Now, Goliath's got a spear and a sword, and he's covered with armor. He's got an armor bearer, and David's got a slingshot. So I don't know. So slingshot in those days wasn't this thing you just pull back like that. You had to whip it around like this and release one end of it, and you got to be accurate with that stone to go where it's going. Well, anyway, David does it. He defeats Goliath with this slingshot, nails him right in the forehead, goes up there. Goliath falls down. Might have created an earthquake. He cuts off Goliath's head. Now, that's pretty common in those days when you've defeated the enemy. And it's pretty decisive when you have his head that he's not going to bother you anymore. Right? So we get this incredible victory. And the rest of 1 Samuel, and just kind of summarizing it a little more quickly, is just the scenario, what happens in the relationship between Saul and David for the rest of the time. Saul, who started out with such promise, descends into a demon-tormented, jealous king who tries to kill God's newly anointed successor to his throne. Saul is really incited to jealousy when he hears the women marching around singing a song, and they're singing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. So he says, why are they attributing thousands, only thousands to me, and 10,000s to David? Seeing that David is finding favor in the eyes of the people. Some of the narrative in that time is between David and Jonathan. They have a covenant with each other. Jonathan is Saul's son, and Jonathan would have been, in a rightful thing, the heir to the throne. But Jonathan sees the anointing on David and actually defers to David and honors David and knows that God has anointed David. And so that infuriates Saul, saying, he says some kind of comment about him, but he relates to Jonathan and says, you son of some kind of, anyway, he degrades him, saying the son of his mother, not his son, but his mother's son. So David has to flee from Saul, because Saul is jealous, angry, wanting to kill him. He's tormented by these demons. When demons get a hold of you, you can get quite angry, and you can get quite evil, get quite aggressive. And so Saul is actually throwing spears at David, trying to kill him. And twice during this time in the 1 Samuel, we see David spares Saul's life. One time he goes into the camp and he's right there. He's got Saul's spear. He can just run him through, and David's buddies are saying, look, God's delivering him into your hands. But there's one thing David understands, and that is, Jesus said later, it's in the New Testament where it says, he who uses a sword will perish by the sword. He knows that if he overtakes the kingdom by violence, that he is likely to be overtaken by violence. So he leaves everything into the hands of the Lord for the Lord to finally give him the kingdom, even though he's been anointed by Samuel as king. David's already been anointed at this time. He's rightful heir to the kingdom, but he's not willing to take it into his own hands. He wants the Lord to deliver the kingdom into his hands. David becomes so distressed, he finally flees from Israel and joins the Philistines. So he joins the Philistines' army, the big opponent, the enemy of Israel throughout so much of the scriptures. And David is so distraught and fleeing and got to get out of Saul's way, so he joins the Philistines. Samuel dies. And so we're getting to the end of the 1 Samuel. Samuel dies. There's not a prophet really left in Israel. And so Saul is in this horrendous place in his life, and he decides, he inquires of the Lord the best he can about what he should do regarding the Philistines, has no answer from the Lord, so he decides to go consult a medium, a witch. And he's actually banned these mediums, spiritists, and witches out of Israel, and yet Saul himself goes to consult one of these mediums. And so in chapter 28, there's a passage here And it's interesting, he goes to the witch. There's a woman who is a medium at Endor, the witch at Endor. I think this is interesting how much biblical understanding has affected culture. There was an old program on TV, some of the older folks may remember, it was called Bewitched. And the main witch on there was a woman named Samantha, but her mother was called Endora. I think they must have got it from here, the witch at Endor. But it's interesting the effect that the Bible has had on culture in so many ways. In verse 9 of chapter 28, it says, but the woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done. So Saul's coming to consult her and says, conjure up for me, please, and bring up for me whom shall name to you. That's at the end of verse 8. So Saul's coming there and wants her to bring Samuel. He's going to tell her that. He's later. But the woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off those who are mediums and spiritists from the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? And Saul vowed to her by the Lord, saying, as the Lord lives, there shall be no punishment upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. And the king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being coming up out of the earth. I want to make a mention here. When it says divine being there's the word there is Elohim. And we usually we think of Elohim in terms of being God, but Elohim is more divine being, a supernatural being. And there's a lot of things referred to in the Old Testament as Elohim, oftentimes referring to God, but even here Samuel is referred to as a divine being, as an Elohim. And she sees Samuel coming up out of the earth, and he said to her, what is his form? And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? And Saul answered, I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and answers me no more, either through prophets or by dreams. Therefore I called you, that you may make known to me what I should do. And Samuel said, why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary? So Samuel's saying, why are you talking to me? Why are you trying to get favor from me? I only speak for the Lord, and the Lord's rejected you. He's your adversary. And the Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. As you did not obey, verse 18, the Lord, and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord, verse 19, will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. So here Samuel does come up. A lot of people say, well, this was some other thing, whatever. The Bible really doesn't say that. It just says, Samuel came up. We're not supposed to contact deceased spirits. Good reason for it. And Samuel had nothing good to say to Saul. He says, you know what, tomorrow you're going to be with me, you and your sons. What a nice word to get. You're going to be dead tomorrow. You're going to be with me. It's not the kind of thing he had in mind when he was calling up the spirit of Samuel. And he says the reason is you did not exercise his fierce wrath on Amalek. Okay? Amalek was the one whose king was Agag, and they spared Agag. Well, Samuel had we didn't read that part, but Samuel took Agag down to the river and slew him at that point. Apparently some of the offspring, lived on, because when we get to the book of Esther in the future, we're going to see that Haman, an adversary against Israel, was actually called an Agagite. Haman the Agagite. And we see the consequences of disobedience here. If Saul would have taken care of all that he was supposed to do in destroying all of the Amalekites and the sons of Agag and everything in that society, we wouldn't have had probably the episode in Esther where once again Israel is threatened to extinction by an Agagite named Haman. And so God says, because you did not exercise the fierce wrath on Amalek and do what the Lord had told him to do, says he's taken your kingdom away from you and he's given it to David, a man after God's own heart.